we have an artist tip for you. So for our artist segment, this one's a fun one. I'm going to be talking about how to fire your producer. Okay, so this can be obviously more generalized as it relates to who you are working with, right? So you have engineers, you have mixing engineers, mastering engineers, you have all kinds of people who can assist in the final production of your music, but we'll just kind of generally say as it relates to a producer. And this is a call that I get often. You guys know I'm a real music attorney. And so when it comes to we've already kind of commenced working on music. It might be a song, it might be an EP, it might be an album, and then something happens in the relationship, and now the parties either mutually want to walk away or my client wants to fire the producer and they're not sure what to do, how to handle it. So the first kind of question that I always ask is, do you have an agreement with that person? Right. So, in the best case scenario, you want to make sure you have a contract with someone that clearly defines the terms, which are things like how much is being paid to the producer, who's going to own the final music, the final master recording, and then other things like back end royalties, right? So, is the producer entitled to a percentage of earnings from the music once it is distributed? Because it's very common that producers will get a couple of points, which would be, let's say, 2%, 3% of net earnings from the music. So we look at, was there a written contract? Because obviously we can reference that now and use that to guide our dispute resolution process. If there isn't a contract, there still is an agreement, and verbal agreements are enforceable. So then I say, all right, so if there's not a contract, do you have, let's say, text messages? Do you have emails? Do you have messages, on social media discussing the terms of your agreement? That's very helpful. And if you do, you have to make sure as soon as there's any question, as soon as there is any potential of a dispute, you need to go and take screenshots immediately because messages get deleted, right? So accounts get hacked, emails get lost. So, especially if there's not a contract, you want to make sure and do your record keeping as soon as possible. But, the point just being, what was the agreement? Whether it was written down or agreed upon verbally, we discuss those terms. And then the other big piece of that, and why we start with the question of was there a contract in place, is because copyright law requires that if assignment of copyright is to occur, it has to be in a written contract, right? So let's say I'm your producer and you're hiring me to do an album for you. Well, as part of our agreement, if you were going to own the final album and all the master recordings, I have to actually sign something in writing giving you that ownership, right? So you might think, well, if I am paying someone to make me an album, then I've paid them and so therefore I own it, right? And the answer is no. And I think the rationale behind this is that, copyright law wants to make sure that creators are ultimately protected. And so if you don't have something, again, as a signed writing saying, hey, I paid you this money, and as a result of that, you are assigning ownership of what you made to me, then it's not going to be enforceable. Okay, so that's a huge thing here. And again, why we start with the do you have a contract? And even if not, it's not the end of the world. But then that usually means we do need to paper something. Okay, and we see and have heard a lot of cases where someone failed to get something in writing having to do with the copyright ownership, the ownership of the, final recordings, and then many years later, there will be a producer who comes back and says, I wasn't paid enough, right? So I'm entitled to back end royalties, or I'm entitled to this, I'm entitled to that. And, obviously at the time, the agreement was, hey, I just paid you $5,000 to create my album. That should be it. But unfortunately, that's just not the way it works. So, what we do then in that scenario when we don't have a contract is that we go back to kind of the beginning, and now we're going to have a negotiation with the producer because now we do have to put it in writing because you want finality, right? And so, this is something that I say a lot to my clients. We want to make sure that everything is finalized, that we sign it, and that it's done. Because if we just kind of come up with an additional agreement, again, if it's a verbal, it's not in writing, it's not final, that copyright assignment didn't happen, and then you're going to be left wondering when's the next claim coming. Okay. So, what we'll do is we'll go into a negotiation process, which often results in us signing an agreement that will say our artist retains full ownership, full administrative rights over the album, of course. Because the other, part here is that it doesn't mean just because the producer still has rights potentially that he or she can just go and release it. No, I mean, they're still the copyright owned by the artist. There's the likeness of the artist's voice on the music. So there are claims to stop the producer from going and distributing the music. But the best way to kind of just clear this up is just to get a final signed writing. And it's very important that everyone, especially artists, especially musicians and producers, all have an understanding of how this works because it ultimately impacts things like ownership of your music, your catalog, which is the most valuable thing that you will have in the music industry. So, what I would say is get together, figure out terms, get it into a writing, and whenever possible, have an attorney helping you through this process. At the end of the day, if you were just kind of doing this yourself and you're like, oh, well, I think we need to have a written contract, there's stuff in the contract that has to be in there. There's boilerplate language that is required. That's how you're going to get this all cleared up. That's how you're going to be able to terminate the relationship and to be able to actually fire the producer. Now, in, a best case scenario, having a contract in place that says you have the ability to terminate the contract, you retain ownership is absolutely ideal. So, in fact, if you're watching this for your next project, make sure you have an agreement with the producer ahead of time. And so if you have to fire that producer, it's already in writing, it's already assigned, you already own your masters, and then it's very clean that way. So that's absolutely what I recommend to my clients.